Welcome to the seminar series of the Hague Programme on International Cybersecurity. My name is Monica Kaminska. Today is our first seminar of the new academic year, and we're very excited to have with us a highly distinguished scholar, Richard Harknett. Richard is Professor and Director of the School of Public and International Affairs and Chair of the Center for Cyber Strategy and Policy at the University of Cincinnati. He also co-directs the Ohio Cyber Range Institute. He has served as scholar in residence at US Cyber Command and the National Security Agency in the US, and continues to provide analysis and briefings for them as well as for a number of other agencies and governments. Having said that, it's important to note that today Richard is not speaking on behalf of any department or agency. Today, Richard is very much wearing his professor hat. So Richard will be presenting his new co-authored book, co-authored with Emily Goldman and Michael Fischerkeller. The title is Cyber Persistence Theory, Redefining National Security in Cyberspace. So Richard will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, after which we will open up the floor to Q&A. Please do feel free to post your questions in the chat while Richard is presenting. So Richard, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Monica, and I want to thank everyone associated with the Hague program for having me here. And those of you joining us, thank you so much for taking time out of your afternoon to think through this idea of cyber persistence and how it might impact both academic approaches to studying this space, as well as the policy implications of it. And I'm going to try to marry those two. So the book is published through Oxford University Press, Bridging the Gap series. And the reason we did that was, in fact, we think that this book sits at that nexus of theory and policy, as Monica indicated. I did go on loan from the university and serve at US Cyber Command and National Security Agency. General Nakasone was kind enough to write the foreword for the book, and so there is an obvious connection between the theory's development and some of the adjustments that the US made. So I'm happy to talk about that side of it as well. I'll touch briefly on that at the beginning of this talk, walk you through sort of the core analytical concepts and why we think it's important to think about this in a different way, and then try to tie it up a little bit with some policy, finish with a comment on Ukraine, Russia, and open it up to your inquiries and exchange. So let me go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to use PowerPoint just to keep myself on track. And hopefully help with the distillation of these ideas. And Monica, if it's appropriate, I can send you this slide deck. I don't know how the seminar series functions, but if you'd want to share this with the audience, that'd be great. That'd be fine if that's helpful. So let me go ahead and jump into this and just set the table in terms of the key points that the book rests on, and some of the things that we might want to talk about as we go through this session here. So the first key point is that when we think about strategy, that strategy should be derived from the strategic environment in which it is being trying to impact. It can't be imposed on it. So we make an argument in the book that there is in fact distinct strategic environments. I'll get to that in just a second. And they have distinct logics. And the main point as it relates to our topic here about cyberspace is that there is a distinct cyber strategic environment, and it follows the logic of what we call initiative persistence. And so therefore, if that holds, if there is a distinct logic in this strategic environment, then however we adjust, however we wish to manage that at the state behavioral level in particular, our strategy has to adjust to achieving initiative persistence, or there will be consequences, right? In this initiative persistent environment, the main key point that we make is that security is going to be obtained through action and anticipating action in order to reduce a majority of adversary activity to inconsequential effect while enhancing your interests, right? What you're trying to achieve in and through cyberspace. That's a loaded statement. I'll admit that right up front, right? Because it is suggesting a very different pivot, a very different, if you will, measure of outcome success than what you would have if you were adopting a deterrence framework, right? Because deterrence is about the absence of action. It's about preventing activity rather than what we are suggesting initiative persistent requires. So there was a strategic shift in the United States in 2018, publicly sort of rolling up through the US's national security strategy, which then led to a change in its national defense strategy, and all the way down to the operational level at US Cyber Command. It required and was supported by authority changes, both at the executive branch level, so a National Security Presidential Memorandum 13 that changed authorities at the operational level, and through the United States' Congress and the National Defense Authorization Act, which changed the legal authorities around operations, making cyber operations traditional military action. And that was important in terms of US law. And I'd be happy to come back to that as we move forward. But stepping back, putting a more academic gloss on this, the book says, well, why would we need that kind of strategy pivot? Is that you have to align to the strategic environment that's dominating your national security concerns. And so for a couple of millennia, we were in this, what we could call a conventional strategic environment. Security rested on the ability to take advantage of offensive capabilities and defensive capabilities. Ultimately, security rested on fighting the potential of fighting and winning war, right? This is the book presents a structural theory. So we think about a strategic environment, if you will, as a structure that creates both imperatives and incentives to act. And the argument, say, for example, in the conventional environment, is when you think about it from a structural standpoint, the marriage of technology to tactics to operations has throughout human history kind of shifted, right? And there are times at which the conventional strategic environment has advantaged the offense. And the extreme example of this is sort of lightning war, blitzkrieg, 1940. There are times where that same set of variables, the technical, tactical, and operational, actually marry up to a structural advantage for the defense. And 1914, the First World War, is a good example of that. Your choice, you always have choice, right, within these environments about how you conduct the pursuit of security. But if you bounce up against the structural imperatives of the environment, there can be severe consequences, right? So, in fact, all of the general staffs in 1914 assumed that this was an offense-advantaged environment and continued to pursue tactics and operations that were misaligned, right, with the fact that it was defense advantaged. But ultimately, we should understand that security is emanating from the interaction between offense and defense. And then in 1945, right, we get this one plane, one bomb, one city change through a major technological leap. And the consequence of the emergence of the atomic and then nuclear weapon was, in fact, a redefinition, if you will, that's the subtitle of our book, a redefinition of the security question. And the security question changes in the nuclear strategic environment to not how do I fight and win war, but how do I achieve my national interests when I can't defend, right? The structure of the nuclear strategic environment is one of offense dominance. An offense dominant strategic environment is one in which, we came up with the right metaphor. You effectively press a button and destructive effect reaches a level of potential national annihilation, right? So the offense in an offense dominant environment, the offense always wins. So it changed that security question to how do I secure when I can't defend? And we came up with a response that was we got to convince the other side to not attack in the first place, right? And that's what deterrence as a strategic response, a strategy response to the logic, the structure of the nuclear strategic environment, one of offense dominance. And so we take that same approach in the book to trying to think through cyberspace. And what we argue is that, in fact, it's neither analytically well understood. It doesn't help us to try to understand this space through an offense or defense advantage. And it's not, in fact, offense dominant. But at its core structural level, it creates a different logic. And it's a logic of initiative persistence. You can defend in cyberspace, but you only defend in the moment on the terrain that exists. And that is the cyber physical system interacting with the software and network configurations. And since I started this talk, that terrain has shifted. So you may have been secure at the beginning of this talk. There's now space that you didn't even know you had to defend that you need to now defend. And so that's what we mean by you can defend, but only in the moment. And you can't attrit in this space, right? That the capacity to find opportunities to exploit while you can defend it, it does not actually take the capacity away from the other state and degrade that capacity ipso facto through your defense, right? So it's a fundamentally different space, we argue, than the conventional strategic environment and the nuclear strategic environment. And since strategy can't be imposed, it has to be derived, we have to understand that logic. It starts with an organizing principle that this space is indeed interconnected. And that interconnectedness leads to a particular condition, a condition of constant contact, not imminent contact, not potential contact, not over the horizon contact, but constant contact. That is, in fact, the implication, the condition that flows from an interconnected system. Now, you can segment, but then you're not in an interconnected space. So the challenge of interconnectedness is that it changes the question, right? How do I secure when I'm in constant contact with adversary, ally, business sector, foreign and domestic civilian? And segmentation is not the answer, because segmentation is to change the structure. So if this is interconnected, then we have to follow through and solve national security through the challenge of interconnectedness. And so ultimately in the book, we argue that persistence is what flows from this structure, this combination of interconnectedness, constant contact, and the peculiarities of this technology, that the technology is fluid. It's constantly being changed, right, at the level of terrain and the ability to maneuver across that terrain. And so the ultimate argument that we land on is that you have to persist operationally because you can defend, so you want to seek and find those opportunities to defend, but the overall scope and scale of adversarial capacity to act is not actually impacted by that defense. And so what do we mean by a structural approach? For those that are not familiar with IR theory, it's basically an approach to theorizing that looks to clarify core causal dynamics. It is by nature the most parsimonious kinds of explanation that you can find in theorizing. But what we argue is that behavior is structured, it's driven by operational and strategic environments in which the actors find themselves in. The core elements, again, of this structure is interconnectedness, constant contact, and a base technology that is fluidly reconfiguring. Right? And when you take these elements together in the book, first couple of chapters, we walk people through and show that in the end, this is a space that's rewarding those that can anticipate the exploitation of vulnerability and exploit others, right? And so therefore, what this comes down to is security being redefined by whether or not you have the initiative in this space. That is, do you have the anticipatory footing, the capacity to anticipate exploitation of vulnerability before it occurs, and when necessary, being able to exploit the vulnerabilities of others. If you have the initiative in those two things, to anticipate exploitation before it occurs, and being able to exploit yourself to advance interest, then you are more secure than relatively the person, in this case, state, next to you. We admit in the book that this can be wholly unsatisfactory, taken from the frame that we have had for the last 70 years, that security rests on the absence of action, right? And here we're saying, now, in this particular environment, your security is just about anticipating the next action. So in the book, we offer basically a logic of exploitation that we argue is different than a logic of coercion. So in the conventional and nuclear strategic environments, ultimately security is being drawn from coercion, right? Either the threat in particular of imposing costs. And this is where the whole logic of escalation management and et cetera comes from. But when we look at the cyber strategic environment, what we're actually seeing, what we're actually observing is not the threat of force to sort of shape decision calculus, but actually what we see is a fairly continuous, robust, and ubiquitous effort to exploit vulnerability. That is, using code to take advantage of others' cyber vulnerabilities for the purpose of gaining strategic advantage. At a national security standpoint, that's what we're interested in, right? Not one-off operations, hacks, et cetera, but whether cumulatively the exploitation can move up to the scale of having strategic advantage. That is, affecting national sources of power. And when you actually look at the majority of behavior in this space, to date, states are basically primarily setting and resetting the conditions of security and insecurity directly for themselves through what we call in the book the cyber fait accompli. And we define that as a limited unilateral gain at a target's expense, where that gain is retained when the target is unaware of the loss or is unable or unwilling to respond, right? It's literally resetting the network, resetting the conditions through which that data moves, and in some cases, resetting the data itself. And then under certain conditions, including sort of high value areas of network, what might be concerned as high level cyber terrain, we do have instances of cyber direct engagement, right? In which you do have one side shifting immediately to shifts that the other side is trying to impose. Hollywood sort of, if you will, the movies version of hacking sort of tends to focus in on this. But when you look at it empirically, it occurs, but it's much less. It occurs much less frequently than popular thought assumes, and so therefore we argue that most of the policy and strategy response to this space has to focus in on this cyber fait accompli, right? That unilateral action is what's most prevalent, and that's what we should be studying. So cybersecurity studies should, what we're offering through this theoretical framework is we should spend a lot less time worrying about and focusing in on the conditions under which one shapes the calculus of others, because the large majority of cyber campaigns that are occurring are not coercive in intent nor in execution. So the challenge for us from a security strategy and policy side, according to the theory, is how do we deal with these exploitations, right? That suggests a lot of activity that's going on, and it may seem to, again, the outside observer, a bit chaotic. But we argue in the book, and we have a whole chapter in the book about how cyber persistence as a structure and the pursuit of initiative persistence relates to stability, and obviously highly relevant to the focus of the Hague program. And so we define in the book cyber stability as this condition within the cyber strategic environment in which states are not incentivized to pursue armed attack equivalent cyber operations or cross-domain attacks, right? Moving into the strategic environment of conventional or nuclear to advance their national interests. And therefore avoid a breach in this sort of tacit upper bound of what we call in the book a cyber agreed competition phenomenon. So if we take empirically what the majority of state behavior is in this space, it's more than zero, right? So we have a base level of action occurring, but there's this upper bound in which states are spending a good bit of effort to avoid what might be construed as armed attack equivalent. And so it's created, what we argue in the book, is that a majority of this behavior is in a strategic competition area, which is distinct from the condition of crisis, where deterrence is relevant. That is the threat. The way you're achieving security is through crisis management and coercion, and in warfight. I'll talk a little bit about where we think the connections are, but the book primarily is setting up an explanation for why states are spending so much time short of armed attack equivalent. And the reason we argue in the book through the theory is that states are incentivized to continually seek rewards from these unilateral actions that reconfigure cyber terrain and the means to maneuver and cause effects in and through that terrain. Right? There's basically an abundance of potential opportunity. And that opportunity, if you can link them up into a campaign approach, there is the potential to shift national sources of power in relative terms. Right? I can degrade your military advantage. I can impact your economic status. I can gain market share, or I can subvert international sanctions. I can start to try to reconfigure the entire network in such a way that it aligns with a more authoritarian information control approach rather than an information dissemination approach that aligns with sort of Western conceptualizations of cyberspace. The risk in this reward abundant environment, we argue in the book, is containable, however, based primarily because of the architecture itself of cyberspace, which was built to be at the macro level systemically resilient. Right? And so the cumulative effects of these cyber fait accomplis are not threatening the overall integrity of the system of network computing. And what the theory actually predicts is a strategic incentive to keep seeking those rewards underneath that agreed attack equivalent. We raise the prospect of what if there is the opportunity to achieve strategic outcome without war. Why would you not seek that, right? War is really unpredictable, expensive, significant loss of treasure, and destabilizing. So if there's an alternative to war, and that theoretically is what's really interesting about cyberspace in a strategic context, if there's an alternative to war, we should expect states to at least experiment in seeking those kinds of returns. And so if you look at most of the behavior, it's staying fairly well below that threshold of armed attack equivalent, and therefore reinforcing the imperative to persist with a strategic choice to persist without without this war equivalent kind of operation. The very vulnerable nature of cyberspace, however, simultaneously, therefore, we have this sort of fascinating conundrum that it's macro resilient, but micro vulnerable. And that's what's helped structuring some of this behavior. Can we move to instability? Sure. And in the book, we argue that there's basically three destabilizing possibilities. One that lots of people haven't thought through, and then two that are prevalent in the literature and discussions about this. And I'll just say very briefly to sort of set us up for conversation here shortly. One is that, well, let's say that you're really good at initiative persistence, and you actually achieve and seize the initiative to the point where you create an imbalance against a particular adversary. You keep, in fact, accumulating gains to the point where their incentive structure changes and they may have to move into the conventional or the nuclear strategic environment to achieve their interests. That suggests a need to be prudent in this space so that as you are engaging in initiative persistence, you don't overshoot the gain side of this. But the flip side also holds, right? If you don't engage in seeking initiative in anticipation of the exploitation of your vulnerability, and you allow yourself to consistently be vulnerable and exploited, then your decline in relative power is going to position you over time to have to make a choice, right? And a fairly unsavory choice of whether, from a position of vulnerability, you have to cross domain and move into a war fight situation. There are the possibility of unintended incidents. Shooting down of airliners is a good example of this. And if you look at that case history, states tend to deal with it through diplomatic processes. And so, yes, we can have unintended incidents in cyberspace. There's nothing in the nature of the space necessarily that precludes using diplomatic processes to make sure that we recognize that we were dealing with an error rather than an intentional act to harm. And then we talk about in the book the prospect of a spiraling action from complex uncertainty. We're at the early stages of this. So we have to be understanding that uncertainty itself is a challenge to stability. And the possibility exists that, cyber fait accomplis that are being used by multiple states could push states to react in such a way that makes traditional force more likely. Again, because the incentive exists to gain so much opportunity, what we're finding is that states are being pretty careful, right, about and it's really aberrant cases, very few cases. It's only cases in which you actually have a war fight underway, in particular, or a prospect of a war fight, that we're seeing a different form of type of an attack. The book goes through a whole new lexicon. So if you have a new theory, you need new language. I won't go through this right now in the interest of time, but we do introduce a whole new lexicon. And ultimately, this did translate into a shift on the part of the United States, and through all of their documents. And again, I'll circulate this slide. The United States started to adopt what was, in fact, it seemed to be in alignment with the logic of initiative persistence. And ultimately, U.S. Cyber Command has talked about continuously operating below the threshold of armed conflict, demonstrating resolve, technical capacity, and persistence to undertake strategic cyber campaigns to gain advantage over the United States. That this is their main concern, and this is where much of their effort has gone. The doctrine of persistent engagement was defined as a doctrine August of last year. General Nakasone has talked about defend forward and persistent engagement as cornerstones. The idea of defend forward has been somewhat misunderstood in the press. To defend forward is to be more active in the U.S. context, not necessarily more aggressive. Action is not ipso facto offensive. The idea behind defend forward is both geographical and temporal. So a lot of people have focused in on the fact that U.S. authorities extended the ability to operate outside of its defense network, and that's the geographical component. But the more important notion of defend forward is this temporal concept of being able to be in a position to anticipate the exploitation of vulnerability before that occurs. That does require you to be in others' networks, but the main goal here is not destruct at the war equivalent level, but rather engaging in such a way that you can maybe keep the aggressor's confidence and capabilities a bit off balance and on guard. It provides you warning, so you can get a sense of intentions and capabilities. It does create some influence in the sense that it can shift the balance of initiative by dialing up organizational friction. So the US has done this in operations to protect its elections by creating organizational friction in the networks of other attackers, so that they have to spend more time figuring out how they protect their networks rather than engaging in cyber-enabled information operations, for example. And it can posture you to move and have effects in other conditions. And so I'll leave you with this to open it up for conversations. A report in the Financial Times of London about a supposed U.S. hunt forward operation in Ukraine in October of last year. The U.S. Cyber Command has acknowledged that it was working with Ukrainian operators, but this story, I'm just talking to you in an open source story, but it's an interesting one for us to think through an example, a heuristic of how cyber persistence translates into actual policy and action. So according to this report, the U.S. goes over to Ukraine and is working with Ukrainian operators. So this is in competition, right? The United States is not at war with Russia, and they find a wiperware on the Ukrainian rail system, and they wind up enclaving this wiperware in such a way that its effects are neutralized, but the malware remains sitting on the network, so that the presumably the Russians who presumably put it there wouldn't know that it was not that it had been discovered and sort of neutralized. And this gives an opportunity in competition to continue to understand adversaries' TTPs. Tanks roll into Ukraine, and one would have presumed, if you had this capability to take down the Ukrainian rail system, that it may have been part of Russian military planning to do so right at the beginning of the conflict. The Financial Times speculates that this might be, in fact, one of the first cyber defensive operations that had an impact at scale, right? Literally saving people's lives. Because we know that well over 1 million people evacuate from Ukrainian cities that are being put under pressure early in this conflict. That's interesting to just think through heuristically, right? Again, the idea that you have an action, you're engaging in hunt forward operations because of initiative persistence and competition. But as the international conditions change, you go from competition to warfight. That same operation has a knock-on effect of saving people's lives, a defensive effect, if you will. What we also see in this report is that there was private sector whole of nation plus, and we talk about in the book that ultimately initiative persistence has to be adopted as a whole of nation approach that aligns not just intergovernmental activity, but private public alignment and individual citizenry alignment. The plus in this is that the United States has to work with allies. So this is exactly in line with the type of activity that we hypothesize in the book. And so the Times article suggests is that private sector component was able to take what it learned back to the U.S. homeland and neutralize the possibility of that type of vulnerability being exploited. So in addition to the hunt forward and improvement of Ukrainian defense and of U.S. Intelligence, you get an anticipatory resilience effect of improving homeland networks. And then the final thing is that in war, and I'll leave this to historians to determine, but if we find that the Russian military strategy was one of blitzkrieg and that they were actually hoping that within the first few weeks to put enough pressure on Kyiv to relent, to give into their demands and surrender, having locked in large populations into cities that could not get out because the rail system was down. The inability to do that, did that have a strategic effect on the way Russia was prosecuting the early stages of this war? Don't know, way too early to tell. Last year, I point out to people that the New York Times on their bestsellers list had a book about the strategic bombing campaign of London. So if we're still writing books in 2021 about World War II aerial bombardment, I think we got to be humble about drawing lessons from current context. But from a theory standpoint, it's really interesting to think about the heuristics. Can the response to initiative persistence, which in the US case is about hunt forward and defend forward, does this anticipatory type of approach actually have effects that produce outcomes in competition? And then when conditions change, actually the resetting of that network can advantage you in warfight. It's an interesting thing to contemplate and to think through. I apologize for running over time there, but Monica, let me open it up to you for questions.
Thank you so much, Richard. You've done an incredible job of synthesizing what I know has been a very long and complex theoretical project. So thank you so much for that. It was really clear and really fascinating.